Hello, everybody, and welcome to the new innovation that is August at IFG. When I was talking to Dean about doing this event, I said, well, yes, you can come in August, but we don't usually do events in August because it's like the equivalent of the day after Labor Day, and we're just not sure whether we'll get any audience. So our first experiment, which is very relevant to a discussion about evidence and policy, was to say, well, let's try it anyway and see if we put it on, will they come? And as you will see, this has been massively well subscribed. So thank you all very much for taking time out or coming back early from holiday, or just the relief that there's something going on in August for coming here today. I'm Jill Rutter. I lead the IFG's work on better policy making. And as those of you who know, or if you don't know, you'll see on the flyer and think, we've done quite a lot of work, including some work on how do you use evidence better in policy making, which look both at the demand from policymakers, but also from the supply side, and said, actually, do academics supply policy evidence to policymakers in forms that they might be keen to use? And that's why it's an absolute pleasure to have Professor Dean Karlan from Yale here today, because Dean is both a very respected academic, described by Rich Taylor as one of the, who you'll know from Nudge, as one of the most creative and prolific young economists around. And if you go through Dean's CV, that is testimony to his prolificity. That's not a word, but anyway, he is extremely prolific. He is extremely prolific. When I thought he must be about 90 to have written that much, but clearly not. So he's doing that, and his work covers a whole range of areas of education, public health, policy papers, working papers, etc., and the extraordinarily intriguing, and do look them up, Halloween papers, which I thought was particularly interesting. So Dean's also written a book called More Than Good Intentions, available from Penguin in the US at least. I wasn't sure whether it's also available in the UK. But anyway.
I think it is, but just a harder route.
A harder route. Anyway, but you can click on his profile and find More Than Good Intentions. But anyway, that's sort of enough introduction of Dean. So what Dean's going to do, he's going to talk for roughly 20 minutes, 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll do the usual thing of have a biff bat with the audience. Quite lots of questions from you, so keep thinking about audiences. Civil servants among you, remember this is all on the record and being filmed. So just think about how you're going to phrase that question in a way that doesn't then mean that early September is also looking for a new job time. So anyway, so without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Professor Dean Karlan from Yale.
Great. Should I?
You can be there. We're multitasking.
I know we have a process here of 20 minutes and then Q&A, but seriously, if you have a question on something I'm saying on a particular slide that's relevant, feel free to stop me and raise your hand, because I much more enjoy open conversations and whatnot than kind of sterile presentations. So this is not. This is a bit of a different talk than, to be honest with you, I'm accustomed to giving as an academic. And that's part of the whole reason that is actually one of the main lessons from this. That, you know, a lot of academic research is done to try to figure out what works, what doesn't, the why, ask questions of testing theories. But academics are not often standing out in front of people who are actually going to do things to try to make sure that that research sees the light of day. And so naturally, like, you know, I could get up and give talks till I'm blue in my sleep on things like microcredit and stuff like this that really gets into the details of research and what we know and what we don't on a particular topic. But it's not the nature of academics to really proactively work with people who are going to use those lessons. And likewise, sometimes that does change the research that's done. If you're actually thinking ahead to how is this actually going to get used? What are we going to do with this? Who's going to do something with this? It sometimes, not always, but sometimes changes the research question itself too. And this is the heart of what Innovations for Poverty Action, which is the nonprofit that I started back in 2002, is doing. And it was started specifically recognizing what I just said, which is that we are there's a couple other reasons why we started it as well, but one of the main ones was realizing that the academic research might be great, and we can learn a lot from testing these theories and publishing these papers, but really, the academic's comparative advantage, what our skill set is not in then working necessarily with the practitioners and government and donors to see that the right ideas get scaled up. And that is, not within the charter of a university. And so that's why Innovations for Poverty Action was started, in order to really bridge that gap. The second main reason it was started, just so you know, as I'll get to, has to do with infrastructure on the ground to actually manage quality research. And again, like if I want to go and set up studies in developing countries, which is what I do every day, it's not easy to do that through, by sitting in an ivory tower back in America at my desk. And it's not easy to do that even just by going for a month or 2 or 6 months and setting up some study, because I have to leave at some point and go back and do other things. And so one of the things that IPA does is create that infrastructure on the ground of collaborations and field work so that we can have better measurement of what's working and what doesn't. Okay. So I've now told you a little bit. I always do this when I give talks, as I always over-talk slides. You think I'd know better by now, but I get to a slide and then I say, oops, I just said that. So here's kind of succinctly put the 3 steps to the process as we see it. And this is, the process I'm referring to is the process of doing it right, of fighting problems in the world effectively. So the first is figuring out what the questions are. That's not, that sounds trivial maybe sometimes, but I think a lot of times when we are looking at a problem and looking at the evidence, the problem often is that we didn't really think through what the right questions were in the first place. And that a lot of mileage can be had just by taking a step back sometimes and making sure that the right questions are being asked. I'll explain in a little more detail what I mean by that in a moment. The second step is about designing the programs and the tests. And this is the lion's share of what you usually see when you hear about this type of work, is you hear, here's some study, it was a randomized trial, it tested A against B, it found that A worked better, and that's the test part, that's the middle part. The third part, which is what I referred to earlier, is about making sure that these lessons get out there, that the answers get used, that it doesn't just go into an academic publication, make someone's CV longer, help them get tenure, and they move on to the next project, right? And that might be fine for that researcher's career, but not much for the world in terms of generating further knowledge that actually gets used and changing the way organizations and donors, investors, government, whoever it is actually doing something. So here's a very simple cartoon, which hopefully this is the state of the world 15 years ago, I think. So you have all this complicated stuff going on. There's this, in this context, that middle gap is and then the world adopts these ideas, right? And in the state of the world, I'd say 15 years ago and plus, felt like there was all this complicated work going on, and then we're like, well then, if we create the knowledge, it'll get used. Let's just assume that away, and then move on. And so that's then a miracle occurs. The point is, we have to get. A miracle does not merely occur. We do not push these things into Econometrica, American Economic Review, and then all of a sudden the world adopts it. So the work that I'm going to tell you about the process, but just to give you a little bit of overview of who we are, so you have a little more context. Innovations for Poverty Action the work spans the world and spans many sectors. We are one part of us. There's a part of us which is not what I'm about to say, but there's a part of us which is a network. And that network is a network of researchers who are all at different universities around the world, who are the intellectual leaders helping to drive the research questions and the design of a lot of the research that we are conducting. And so as a nature of being a network of that sort, we also are across many sectors, from health, education, water, sanitation, micro-savings, credit, small, medium enterprise, governance, agriculture. And there's many studies which seem very straightforward, that are very much in our way of thinking of where a randomized trial can shed important insights. There are some other areas where they might be at first blush not so obvious that a randomized trial could be used, for instance, in fighting corruption. And there's a lot of studies that have been shown different ways that are more effective and less at fighting corruption. This does not mean, for the record, that all things out there that are being done can be tested with a randomized trial. This is deliberately not a methods conversation, although if someone wants to have a question on that, I'm happy to, we can digress for a little bit. But I'm not going to get into details of randomized trials in terms of what I prepared here. But I do just want to make the message clear that there are, I think, there's a large category of things for which we've been doing randomized trials and are very straightforward and obvious. And there's also a large category of things which are less obvious as to how a randomized trial can shed important insights that non-randomized methods do not do as good a job on. But there's also an important block of things that are just not appropriate for randomized trials. And that's, in some sense, one of the challenges in this space is figuring out which is which and making sure that you don't do randomized trials where you shouldn't be and that you are doing them when you could be. So back to Richard Thaler. You mentioned one of the intellectual grandfather of the nudge unit, along with Cass Sunstein. He was also one of my advisors, so I'm loyal to him in many ways, intellectually as well as personally. And he has two very simple lines that he uses, which I think are perfect in this context for what we're talking about. And the second one, I'm going to discuss it in two levels. The first is you can't make evidence-based policy decisions without evidence. That seems pretty straightforward. Obviously, the definition of the word evidence is what's the tricky part there, right? No one's going to disagree with that first statement. That's not controversial, right? So the controversial part would be when we start getting into the details of particular pieces of evidence and start arguing whether that constitutes evidence or not. The second, if you want to encourage some activity, make it easy. So I'm going to talk about that in two ways here. One is I'm going to talk about that with a couple examples, and this is the context in which Thaler is intending it explicitly. The context in which he's talking about this, he's talking about government policies that are trying to enroll people in certain activities, in savings behavior, in job search process, things like this. And the idea is make it easy and it's more likely to happen. And so I'm going to give you a couple examples of that as well, where we have seen good tests, randomized trials in the field with two different methods of doing things, or three or four or five. And it is absolutely true that one general theme to what works and what doesn't is the easier you make it for someone to do something, the more that you can make it so that that inertia will have them doing it, or lack of proactive steps will have them doing something, the more likely you are to have them do it. And this is something that I think is intuitive, but yet at the same time, it would shock us all to see how often policies are implemented without doing it. The second context in which I mean it is about our work here that we're doing. How do we get these ideas into action? Right? And we take that same principle of making it easy and we try to think about that ourselves in terms of how are we getting it so that it's easy for government to adopt good policy. Right? And there's no opt-in, we can't do that. Right? We're all familiar with the kind of opt-in, opt-out canonical example of making it easy. So organ donorships in America and Europe, if you look at which countries, or in the US, which states make it so that you opt in to being an organ donor, fill in this little form and become an organ donor, versus opt out, fill in this little form and then you won't be an organ donor. And that has huge, huge impacts on whether or not you are an organ donor or not. Right? In both cases, you get a choice. It's whether to be an organ donor. No government is ever telling you have to or cannot be an organ donor. They're just making it so that what's the default if you don't do anything, and voila. Right? So there's no way to do that really, right? And if you're trying to work with the government to improve education, you can't change the default status so that they automatically, unless they take proactive steps otherwise, would adopt a more effective remedial education program for children. So, right, so the make it easy mantra is harder, ironically, to implement in the context, but I think there are important examples I'll give you at the end that we're working on that are about making it easier. Okay. So let's go back to these three steps. Figuring out what questions need answering. There's three questions. When I teach undergraduate and PhD and master's, and as evidenced by what I'm about to say, when I give talks like this, there's three questions that I almost always insert somewhere into my talk. It is relevant for just about everything I think about. And this is the nature of being an economist, perhaps. But I start off by thinking, markets work. That if we just can sit back and there's perfect information, everybody is well informed, there's zero transaction costs, so when someone has a trade to offer and someone else can get that trade and they can make trades and everyone's better off, the world's a great place. Okay, so we start off with that as like the first order thing. But then, obviously, I don't always think that's right. I wouldn't be standing up here today trying to do things of this nature if I thought the world was just working perfectly. So the challenge is really thinking through where's the assumption wrong? Where did that fall apart? Why aren't markets working? So the point is, when you're trying to understand whether a certain policy is effective, if you have some understanding as to why there's a problem in the first place, why the system was not working, that gives you a lot more legs for the idea. So that, in that sense, that allows you to go to other contexts with some understanding as to why something is working and implement it. Very simple examples of market failures would be externalities. So worms are an example of an externality. If I'm infested with worms, I will pass those worms onto other children in my playground. That's the nature of the worm. It gets out of my foot onto the soil and into someone else's foot. Right? And so that could make it be a market failure where I don't have enough private returns to myself to cover the cost of taking a deworming pill, because I don't take into account all of the costs that I'm passing on to everybody else. Right? Simple example that from my own personal life is the flu shot, which I learned recently is not a very common thing in the UK. I'm kind of curious about that. Not sure why, but in the US, in like December, January, it's always the rage. Everywhere you see, get your flu shot, get your flu shot. So up until this year, I always took the tongue-in-cheek attitude that I don't need to get a flu shot. Because why? Because my wife and 3 kids are all getting the flu shot. So I don't need to. So I never did. This year I got pneumonia. My wife was very happy about that. So now I've kind of more or less agreed to get the flu shot. So the point is, you don't always, if you, externalities happen and there's lots of public causes where the private costs of doing something are higher than, and one side note is we think I might have actually passed it on to one of my kids who got a mild flu too. And so, there was an externality for me getting it to one of my kids potentially. So the point is, that's a case where there's a public cause to subsidize flu shots and really encourage it. And it makes everybody better off. If everybody's acting optimally on their own, then you don't always end up with what's the optimal outcome socially. So the second question is, does a particular intervention solve a market failure or not? Is it working? And the third question is, how good is it? Right? At the end of the day, resources are scarce. I don't care who we are, whether the richest man in the world or government or whatnot. We have to choose across good ideas. And so it's not good enough to just say something works. We have to say that it works better than our other alternatives. And so there are many situations where we might actually have an idea that we know is good, and yet we still want to test it side by side to something else in order to figure out which is the better approach. So the B is the designing programs and designing tests. So different pieces to this, and one of the most important pieces that we have found along the way for both what I just went through as well as B has to do with who's at the table as this process is happening. And this is going to get to the C in a moment, where we're talking about how we use this evidence to make sure it gets scaled up. So, if we're going back and thinking through these questions, all are on our own, we might be great academic theorists in posing these questions, but if we're not doing it in collaboration with people on the ground who are also facing these problems, the local government, as the case may be, then we're often missing out on contextual factors, which might be really important in helping to make sure we have the right theories that we're testing. And secondly, and perhaps even, well, I don't want to say more importantly, equally importantly, when local partners are part of the process all along in thinking through what are the research questions we need to be posing, what are the studies we need to be setting up, they're more likely to adopt those policies in the end. So some of the biggest success stories we've had have to do with not where we were necessarily partnered up in a formal contractual way, but just where we were engaged throughout, and recognizing that to the extent that we can't treat research, evidence does not get taken up simply by doing a research study, getting it out there, and then talking about it. But that it really is a matter of building relationships on an ongoing basis. And that's a large part of what we're now doing on the ground. And so part of this process here in B in designing tests also includes those types of partnerships. So the types of things that are important here are, let me jump to the second, boots on the ground infrastructure for quality field work. I'm in the middle of starting the early stages of a book called Failures. It's a very simple book. It's not intended to, it's a series of case studies on failed projects, partly to appease my feelings of guilt for having done these stupid things. And hopefully, I'm hoping some other people put in their failures too, so it's not just a list of my failures. But they're failed research studies. There's one consistent theme. Each one has a little bit of a different story to it as to what went wrong, but there is one that is the most dominant, is that when there weren't sufficient on the ground, boots on the ground, monitoring and working on a project, that things then, take in a randomized trial, then treatment groups didn't get treated and control groups did, things like this. There was a disconnect and the right data didn't get collected at the right time. And so more often than not, when we see problems in the field, and this is true when I talk to other people too, who don't have support on the ground, instead just have a grad student, for instance, who's helping, but the grad student has other things in their life too. And so one of the things that we have learned at IPA is that you really need on-the-ground infrastructure to support projects. And that it's not a question of one person just living there full time, but it's really a question of a genuine support network of resources for questions when problems arise. And it is a question of physical presence as well. Okay, the third part, doing robust tests which yield decent quality evidence. So here, specifically, what I'm partly getting at is running fair tests, which is in the next one. So a fair test, what I mean by fair, this is using a term that I first heard in this exact context from my understanding. Ben Goldacre uses this term a lot in his writings about randomized trials. The point being there's a fair allocation across people. Some interesting studies have often come about using randomized trials when the reason for doing the randomized trial had nothing to do with researchers. It was entirely about being fair. It was entirely about a government saying, we have a scarce resource. We're going to give out 50,000 scholarships to a school, and we know that we will have more households that want this scholarship than money that we have in this program. So how do we do this fairly? And then someone says, I got an idea. We'll take all the applications that want to do it. We'll take all the people, there's some qualification criteria. We'll filter out the people who are not qualified. We'll end up with a number of people. Maybe that number is 80,000. We have 50,000 slots. Then we'll draw a lottery, and 5/8 will get this scholarship, and 3/8 will be told, sorry, it's fair though. It was open. It was done publicly, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a situation oftentimes when the researcher then can come in and say, ooh, that sounds really nice. I'm glad you did it that way. I can do a study. And there are examples of exactly that happening. And so the term fair is really a well-chosen word to describe a fair process that also, by luck, leads to an opportunity to get clean measurement of whether something is working or not. The last point is something which goes at the heart of one of the reasons why I started IPA way back when, but it's also, in some sense, one of the weaker areas that we have seen in terms of the way the world has progressed, and that is retesting. So it is definitely part of our mantra, but there aren't as many examples as I'd like to be able to give you of that happening. It's a hard nut to crack, partly because researchers don't want to do studies that have already been done. There's not as much reward for researchers. And funders often sometimes too have a hard time funding things if they've already seen the exact same study. We are tackling it. There are examples we have of this working, but it's always done when there's a really high-level collaboration and planned out from the very beginning of saying, no, we really need to have 8 of these tests. But that is one of the most common questions I hear about the evaluation space is, how do you take lessons from South Sudan and go to Morocco or Peru or Mongolia and know whether those lessons will translate? And I always have 2 answers for this. One is to say, well, what's the alternative? I could either have more tests, which would obviously be better, but it costs more money, or I could go to 0 tests. Which one do I prefer? right? So I prefer to have more tests, not infinite tests, right? But maybe more than one, because I totally agree that we can't just take one study and be done. And I definitely don't want to let that be a criticism of any one study that then thwarts our desire to do any one study. Having said that, let's say there's a situation where I can't have any more studies on something, and I'm just trying to decide, with this one study from Rwanda, can I use this lesson in Mongolia? Well, I know that I maybe don't want to use it exactly where it takes me and shifts me entirely. My opinion swings totally to exactly conform with what that study in Rwanda found, but it should shift me some. It should certainly shift me more than no studies, right? So if I think about how much I want to use evidence, it's very context specific, but the point is 1 is better than 0, 2 is better than 1, 3 is better than 2. At some point, the marginal one does create negative value, right? I don't know what that point is, and that's going to be very different. I'm not going to sit here and establish the number is 12. But there is some point at which that provides negative value. And by negative, what I mean here is I'd prefer to use that money to deliver services or to do some research on something else, taking it from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. There are very few things in the world that I think fit that bill, at least that I've seen, where the evidence is so preponderant, that so overwhelming that we're kind of at the point at which no further research should be done, and that would and we should move the money over to other questions. But we definitely, we do need more retesting of things. So we have a pretty wide network. This is, I think, in some sense, the most exhilarating part about what we all created. By putting this infrastructure on the ground, we really made it so that researchers who want to be the dorks that we all are, which are just data people and theorists who are motivated by real-world questions, but are trained not in doing field work. We're trained in analyzing data and posing theories and testing them. And so by putting this infrastructure on the ground that does the work to see the scale-up type work happens, and that does the work to monitor the high-quality research, we became a sponge for researchers. And this is as you can see, the spread of people across the world now doing research with us. Okay, so now let's talk through what I mean by, if you want to encourage some activities, make it easy. Going back to Dick's quotes about evidence and easy. So I'm going to first apply this inward looking, and then I'm going to give you a few examples about applying this in developing countries to policy. So how do we make it so that the adoption of evidence is easy? Well, one easy example is by not writing like a bunch of technical wonky people who only speak to each other. Right? So, there's a lot of journals out there that are incomprehensible even to a lot of economists, nonetheless to everyday people. And I'm embarrassed to say that I have a few that are probably like this too. There's always a spectrum of how technical something is, and one of the things that we strive for is to de-jargonify. De-jargonify? Is that a word? The writing, and really put a lot of policy papers out there, brief cases, a spectrum of papers. Sometimes they're long papers, but that are written for an audience that is a kind of an informed, engaged individual, but not someone who is academically trained. There's no Greek letters throughout the paper. But we've also learned that sometimes to make it easy, you gotta, for example, I had a meeting last week with a group. We sent them a 1.5-page summary of what we wanted to do. We tried getting it to 1 page. It ended up 1.5, 1 3/4 page. We figured, okay, this is good. It was well written. There was no jargon in there. We went into the meeting. Everything was great. He goes, good. So, okay, so now all I need to do to get some other people on board is a summary of what you want that I can pass on. And I'm thinking to myself, didn't I give this to you? He's like, no, I want it shorter. I want 1 paragraph. That's all they're going to read. I'm like, really? 1.5 pages? That was so bad? Yes, 1 paragraph. So there we go. So even, as we all know, that a lot of times to make things easy to adopt, you have to figure out how to digest it all the way down to a paragraph. And that's sometimes hard when it's a complicated policy that you're talking about. And sometimes it's not though, right? There are some ideas that you can digest down and make that simple. And then let the wonky person get the deeper paper, but if you can't manage to get it down to a page or a paragraph, then that's going to be a problem. So you got to make it easy. Okay. Second is graphs. And giving people visualization, but also, in a sense, simplifying the analysis. Now, when you simplify the analysis, obviously you get a lot of things wrong in the sense that you're oversimplifying to some extent, so ignoring some issues, focusing too much on one thing. So, as an example, well, let me actually go this way. So, making a comparison between interventions. Suppose you have a goal of additional years of schooling. You want to spend $100, and you want to know, for every $100 I give, what will increase schooling the most? So I have a few choices, which you now have seen before I took them away. So for those who didn't read so fast, raise your hand if you think the one on the left, which is the most effective one, is either giving out school uniforms, because without a uniform you can't go to school, giving out school food in school. You go to school basically to get the food, and you get sucked into learning too while you're at it. Giving a scholarship. How about just paying people to go to school? Like just get a conditional cash transfer. Or deworming them, giving them a pill so that they get rid of intestinal worms. So who thinks it's school lunches? Did you all see the answer? Okay, I thought it was only up there for a second, but there you go. Deworming on the left. Now, so, clear winner in this simple metric of the world of additional years of schooling. Any other reason why you might want to do any of these 5 things? So this is really simple and easy. And don't get me wrong, we're huge fans of this. We can count tens of millions of children that have now been dewormed around the world as a result of our scale-up work that we've been directly engaged in. Okay, and this chart is like been touted all over when trying to showcase this. But it's not to say it's the end all. So in a crowd like this, hopefully you can see that I'm trying to make the balance. I want to make it easy, but at the same time I want to make you realize that we're not being stupid about things. Right? So there's many measures, there are many outcome measures that you might care about. Suppose you care about redistribution of wealth as an outcome measure. All of a sudden, conditional cash transfers are a totally different beast. The reason why these things are so far down here as being ineffective is because you're transferring a lot of money to people who are going to school anyhow. Isn't that just horrible? No, I don't think so. Right? That's just a transfer program now. We're talking about transferring to people who are poor. There was a poverty targeting program that transferred to people who are poor, conditional on going to school. So for some people, it made them go to school. This is a chart which just gives us the effectiveness of increasing school. But it adds into the cost. There's 2 things that are being paid. All the kids who are going to go to do something else and are now going to school, they're part of the cost. And all the kids who are going to go to school anyhow and are now going to go to school still, they're part of the cost. So if you're going to shift attendance from like 85 to 90%, what that means is 85/90ths of your program is wasting money if the only thing you cared about was increasing school attendance. Okay, but it's not, right? We also are doing this program partly as a social safety net, as to just transfer money to the poor. And so the point is, when you do get more complicated outcome measures, these things can flip around. And partly it depends on who your audience is and what you're doing. So if the goal is increasing school attendance, then we can focus like a laser in on that and say, okay, here's our choices for doing that. Another way we make it easy is by working with people, realizing that making it easy often is a matter of doing things like training, spending time with people, sitting down, explaining the work, and helping people learn how to digest and understand and sift between good and bad research. And some of that is done through training. We are academics, so we'd like to think that we can teach. And so we've taken that lesson to the developing countries, and we've set up a lot of executive education programs where we all engage with policymakers, researchers in local countries. So part of this is about partner finding, part of it is about dissemination of the work to make sure that the ideas are getting out there. And so we've been, from the very beginning, we've been doing executive education. I think we're up to somewhere between 4 to 6 a year now that are done around the world in different languages too. So in the technical assistance is another part of making it easy. Right? We know if we just show someone a paper that says deworming will lead to the following positive benefits to you, the following positive benefits to those around you, and so there we did all the math for you. It's there on the page 17 with an appendix to follow, and voila, so you have what you need, and now we're going to walk away. That doesn't help a minister figure out, okay, how do I actually do this? And one of the main things that we learned with deworming that was striking was that the departments of education saw deworming as a health thing. That's deworming. We do education. The Ministry of Health, on the other hand, they work through their health clinics. And that requires people going to the health clinic. And so they're not reaching children in the same kind of way and to be able to do a kind of a blanket deworming program. And so what we found is the impact that we were able to generate happened by getting the Minister of Health and Ministry of Education together and saying, wait a second, this is a health intervention to be implemented through the schools. Doing school-based deworming helps lower the cost of getting the worms into the children. I'm sorry. Worms out of the children, pills in. And so that was a key insight, was seeing how to make it easy to get these pills done in mass scale was by doing it through the schools. But part of that process was a lot of technical assistance that we gave along the way in terms of training of a whole network of people, because it's layers, right, and all the way down to the teachers, and then we have to train the trainers of the teachers, et cetera. And so that's the type of work that we recognized had to be done, and that we did, in order to see that this very simple lesson of deworming is a cost-effective way of increasing school attendance actually got implemented. And it was not done just by standing up at conferences and telling people, hey, look, here's this paper, go read it, and here's a one-page summary. So lastly, I want to talk about some examples of making policies easy in terms of the actual policies. And so this is the context when Thaler's talking about the nudge unit that he's referring to. So one example is timing cash payments with needs. A striking study in Columbia found it was a conditional cash transfer program that delayed the payment to the household. So in a very typical economist model of the world, delaying the payment cannot make anybody better off, unless it comes with a really nice interest rate along with it, but it did not. And yet what ended up happening was, people were much more likely to enroll their children in secondary schools when the cash payment as part of the transfer was delayed to be timed with when the secondary school payment was due. Similarly, lock-in savings for future needs. We've seen a lot of evidence from different contexts in which commitment savings, which is broadly speaking some sort of savings account which helps people lock their money away for the future. Or maybe it commits them to making deposits. There's many different ways of kind of helping people do this, but the point is committing them in some way to a habit of saving. And we've seen in Uganda, for instance, that offering people an account which locked up their money, but when they got it out, they were free to spend on whatever they wanted, but that led to higher school expenditures for the household and higher test scores for children by giving them access to a savings account that was simply locked up so that when the money came out, they were then able to use it right there on school expenses at the same time. Bundling chlorine with water collection is another example of making it easy. Lots of ways we could argue about getting people clean water. They all sound great. I can show you glossy brochures for every one of them. Let's get point-of-use chlorine bottles and tablets, and let's distribute them to houses. Piped water, not always actually feasible. I mean, hopefully in 20 years, this is a conversation we won't be having, and there'll be piped water and clean everywhere. But until then, we have to deal with other approaches. Cleaning wells and cleaning springs was another approach. The idea was that there was just the contamination was happening right there, and if you clean the well source the spring source, then the people will end up using cleaner water. What we found was the most cost-effective was putting what we refer to as a chlorine dispenser, which is a simple mechanical contraption that goes right by the point of the source of the water, the well. So the minute they get the water, if it's the water they're going to drink, they put a dollop or two of chlorine into the water. And by the time they get home, it swishes together and it's clean. And so the point here is they made it easy. They bundled it. They made it so that it's really just seen as one step, not two. And that made a world of difference. The other advantage of this over point of use of little chlorine tablets at home is the distribution channel. Right? So the distribution channel is make it easy from the supply side. If you have to distribute to the households, you're not making it very easy on yourself to figure out who actually needs, who does not, and setting up that whole network to get it all out there. Going one per village to the well, that's easier on the supply side. So the general, the fourth general rule is when there are ways of opting out rather than opting in, that is going to lead to huge changes in differential behavior. And so that is a moment where you as a policymaker have no choice, right? This is the mantra of the nudge unit. It's not, there's many a thing where there is no such thing as not taking a stand, right? Whether you do it one way or another, or even taking a step back and saying we're not going to make it either, it has to be active choice. Any way you do it, you're taking a stand. So there is no such thing as a neutral on a philosophical level. And so you might as well take the choice that is closer to what most people say they would want in a moment of self-reflection. And that's really the heart of what kind of the nudge concept is about, in choosing between opt-out and opt-in. So as a perfect example of that, so our mailing list. So one of our ways that we need to make it easy for people to get evidence is to actually give them the evidence, to get them signed up on newsletters and things like that. So here's is our simple way of making it easy. We have a pad, a paper. So because we don't know who's not here that have signed up, right? So we can't just take the list that you guys all signed up for and add you to our newsletter because because there's people who signed up who didn't come, right? And so they haven't opted in, and they didn't. So, make sense? So this is a list now, making it easy, and there's an envelope too. So if you have a business card, all you have to do is put your business card in. Had we planned this ahead, we would have put it right into the registration, and it would have just said, by registering for this event, you give permission for us to email you, and you can opt out whenever you want. Right, and that's true, by the way. You sign this up. We're just like anybody else. There's just an opt-out thing on the bottom. Unsubscribe when you want. I do it all the time when I realize that it's been 2 years and I've never once looked at the email. But hopefully that won't be the case. We want to make it easy for everybody to get our information. So do please pass that around. And like I said, if you just throw your business card into the envelope, that's fine too. Either one is fine. And then we will add you to our newsletter, and then you can opt out whenever you want. So that's us making it easy. So what are the barriers to supporting, to evidence-supported programs? Think about it as three I's: ignorance, inertia, and ideology. And so first of all, ignorance, most obviously, evidence helps try to beat down ignorance. That's the whole point. The worst is ignorance combined with arrogance. I'm the most ignorant that can be on many a topic, and I pride myself in being very clear about what I know and what I don't, or at least I try to be. And when I don't know something, I try to go get evidence. So that's the more obvious. Inertia speaks a lot to the opt-in, opt-out. Right? There's a lot of policies that are in place arbitrarily one way versus another. And as we all know, inertia keeps it going, keeps policies in place. And it's much harder to get someone to stop doing something than to get them to actively do it. We actually react very viscerally to this on ethical reasons, right? There's one of my favorite examples of this kind of active versus inactive is a classic philosopher puzzle. There's a train going down 2 tracks. Going down, and there's a switch, and it can switch from one track to the other. There's 5 people on one track who are going to get killed if you don't flip the switch. But if you flip the switch, it'll go to the other track, and only one person will die. Right? Do you flip the switch or not? Right? Most people agree they'll flip the switch, given that choice. But then the other way of doing it is saying there's 5 people on a track, and then in front of them, half a mile before, is 1 person on a track. And there's a big boulder. And you can push the boulder off the hill, smack the person who's on the track, and kill them. But the boulder will then also stop the train, saving the 5 people. And most people won't push the boulder. Right? That's too active. Right? Very subtle differences, and we all can laugh about this and realize that this almost seems silly, but that is true. If you ask these 2 questions independently without pointing out the similarity of them in any way whatsoever, you will get radically different proportions. Right? So we respond very differently to changing things than in a very active way than to passive. And so inertia can get in the way of adoption of evidence. And lastly, of course, is ideology. Right? At the end of the day, there's a lot of debates that are grounded in some sort of philosophical tenets that do make some empirical assumptions, which one could get evidence to guide, but the belief is so strong that evidence is not going to help. So here I can't help but think about sports analogy. Forgive me for those who aren't into sports. God forbid, I might actually use a baseball analogy, but I'm trying to think of a football one. But suppose a simple football one would be there's a foul. I'm heading to tonight's game. So it's not a very controversial game. It's not Arsenal Man U or something. Suppose it was Arsenal Tottenham, and there was a foul, and we had a bunch of fans in the room. Some for Arsenal, some for Tottenham, and it was a close call. Right? It wasn't so obvious to an objective person who didn't give 2 hoots about British football. They would look at the foul, and the people, the experts would have been split 50-50 as to whether it was a foul or not, right? But of course, you get the Tottenham Arsenal fans in the room, and you ask them to split, and of course, you're going to get 100-0 or 0-100, depending on whatever, right? The point is, they're all going to go with their hearts in terms of viewing the evidence the way they want to. And this is true of our beasts, and the better the evidence, hopefully the better we can do. So if it was a really good video, which had really good evidence, so you could really see the foul, then maybe some of the people on the team that they actually did the foul would be like, yeah, okay, I admit it, that was kind of a foul, right? So better evidence kind of can beat down ideology, right? If the evidence is weak and can be manipulated, then you're just going to get everybody to be stuck with whatever their ideology was in the first place. Okay. So that's it, actually. I'll end with the football analogy. I mean, this is just a regurgitation, just to remind you all of the three basic parts to, as we see it, the basic process. Finding out the questions, then go and set up tests, get the evidence, and make it easy to get the results adopted.
Okay. Well, that last comment's probably very...
And also, there's our contact information, too.
So, Dean and Caroline, who's also in the room looking around, and who actually gave us the introduction to Dean. So, Dean, if you come and join us, then we'll open it up for some questions. Dean's probably very disappointed that none of you challenged him during that talk. It's quite interesting, the last comment about evidence, given that I think football's finally catching up with tennis and cricket by having some use of technology to do it. But as those of you that followed the last Ashes series will know, the decision review system doesn't necessarily rule out all controversies by introducing that. So anyways, a bit of cricket analogy because it's still the summer as it's technically known. So we're going to take clumps of 3 for starters. If you're in the spillover room, the innovation room, you'll be pleased to hear that it's called, and you would like to ask a question, can you make your way into the main room, and then we'll be sure to ask you. But we're going to start off in this room, and we've got some questions here. So let's go there, and then there. That's a very easy one. So yes, please.
Hi, I'm Michelle Shipworth, University College London. I'm curious whether you have any comment on economists often talk about market barriers, and then you're exploring what might be the possible market barriers. Do you ever look at what the market drivers might be, and whether that might come up with different research questions?
Okay, Dean.
Market drivers.
Can you give me an example? What do you mean?
I suppose when I look at energy, I research energy use in homes, and very often we're very fixated on what are the barriers to people, for instance, installing insulation and rather than looking at the various drivers, which can often be quite different to why people might either adopt.
Why do they adopt rather than why don't they adopt?
The drivers rather than the barriers, and whether that might develop, whether you might end up developing different research questions as a result.
Sure.
Okay. Yes, and then
Can I just go back and it's easier for me
Yeah.
to do.
Okay,
I have a very short memory.
Okay.
Do you want me to stand up or can
Next
you guys
one
hear me?
can.
Can you guys hear me fine? Can I sit? Okay.
Sit.
That's great. So maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I would describe that as, really the flip side of the same question. We're basically, let's take energy efficient appliances. There's certainly been work that tries to look at the obstacles. You could say high price is an obstacle, but you could also say low price is a driver. So I think for most things, at least if I'm understanding your question correctly, I would say that they're both fitting under the umbrella of just saying we need to understand more about what are the factors which drive people to adopt or not adopt, and that's the same thing. The one exception that I would say that is different is there are times, so let me use an example of, suppose that we decide that we think that information is the reason people are not adopting something, so that's the obstacle. And so that's one of the tenets of perfect markets. You have to have perfect information. You don't have that. You don't get trades that are happening. People are not buying something that makes them better off because they don't have good information. So one way of tackling that, if you understand that that's the driver, is to say, let's give them information. But maybe it's really hard to give them information. Maybe it's costly to give them information. Maybe they don't believe the information. And so even though you know that it's information, you give them a test, you do some diagnostic, they don't know anything about it. Clear about the information. That doesn't necessarily mean that information is always the right way to tackle it. It might mean that a subsidy is actually just give them a subsidy and get things started, and then information will spread once that subsidy happens, or people will just mimic their neighbors, things of this nature. And so you might end up getting the right behavior for the wrong reason. So that's an example where I would say the barriers are different than it's not just the flip side. The barrier in that case is information, but the driver is lower the price and get them to take up. But that's just an example of one thing that, it's going to be, in many settings, I think they will mimic each other.
Okay, we've got lots of people to ask questions, so rapid fire, yes.
Sure. Joe Gladstone, PhD at University of Cambridge. It was great to hear you talk about the retesting of the trials you're running, because I think that people in this country, particularly from the evidence from the Nudge Unit, have got very excited about how small, proactive behavioural interventions can have big effects on behaviour. But I wonder if we're thinking enough about the sustainability of those interventions, and if we can separate that out from novelty. Because if you are a rural worker in Bangladesh and you get a text message reminding you to take some kind of drugs or some other kind of proactive behavioural message, then that's actually a very surprising thing to receive. And I feel like that in lots of the randomized control trials that I read about, no one's really separating that intervention out from the novelty aspect of how powerful it would be. And once you get multiple government agencies, multiple businesses, maybe all trying to influence behavior in this way, do you think that you could crowd these out, the effects out? So when you're retesting, I wonder how much you kind of measure the compounding effects of how different behavioral interventions might work when they're all being used at the same time.
So do you retest on the same population
so I think to get at what you're describing, I would say there's two things that you need to do to get at the issue you're raising. One is look at long-term behavior of the same people, which you do see a lot of studies which do that exactly to try to understand whether you just did a short-term blimp or not. The other is placebos. So take a messaging, to use your example. Like if that were done well, there would be multiple different messages. So if novelty were the case, you'd see that across the different messages. And then the question is, did one message work better than the other messages? So I think, in what you're describing, there's no one simple abstract answer to it. But retesting in somewhere else completely doesn't get at your novelty point. Because the novelty could also predict in the same thing over here that the messaging worked for a very short run compared to nothing for exactly the same reason of novelty. So you need multiple treatment arms and longer term to get it, what you're describing as the novelty effect.
There may be some people here from Behavioural Insights. I think they are doing some sort of retesting to see whether the same people actually have the same reaction second time round when they've got their letter telling them that 95% of people in Exeter pay their tax on time, and why don't they, even though they've refused to pay it for the second year running.
And there's lots of reasons. Even if we retest and don't find it works, it doesn't mean that the first result got it wrong. I mean, you show me the company that has used the same advertising slogan for 50 years, right? I mean, the fact is you do effective messaging does change things up and mix it around a bit.
Okay, front row.
Hi, I'm Claire Hickson. I'm from Trio Policy. You put ideology in the end as one of your obstacles, but one of the things that the development sector is criticised for is for saying politics is really important, but we're not going to factor it into how we think about how to develop our programmes and implement them. So do you actually do any work in terms of working out the evidence around what works in terms of influencing politics, or how programmes can be more effective at factoring politics in from the beginning of the process?
Yeah, no, first of all, I mean ideology is different than politics, is in the way I was using the term. But by all means, there's a lot of research done on how, on the political process itself, using these ideas. And the political process, including what are effective ways of empowering local communities to influence the government, or to help the government provide better services to them. There's been a lot of research done, I've done some myself as well, about on actual voters, trying to understand more about this. So this, I wouldn't say this is like it's on a program, right? But it's understanding more about how people are moved around and persuaded from one politician to another. I ran a randomized trial in the United States where we randomly subscribed people to newspapers, left-wing and right-wing newspapers, and a control group that got nothing, to see did it change who they voted for, and it did, just by giving them a free subscription for 6 weeks. We opted them in. So there's certainly a lot of, I don't know if I've answered your question, but research that intersects on that question and does dive into the political process as a vehicle for change, and understanding what are the effective ways of using politics to create better policies.
Yes, let's have a few more questions. So we're going to do it sort of, rapido questions. So let's come to the front. Kerry, here. And then we'll go to there.
Thanks. I wanted to come...
Can you tell us who you are?
Yes, Liz Faber with DFID. I wanted to come back to your point about the transferability or generalizability of results. And I was curious if you could comment on, or I should say, a lot of the work that you were presenting was the demonstrating the impact and what the impact was, but less so about the how and why some of those changes took place. And I was wondering if you could comment on how IPA is looking at or investigating the political, social, economic, historical contexts that might contribute to success of those experiments.
So I think I'm hearing I have two levels of answering your question. One is about what we do to try to understand why something is working. And then the other has to do with the kind of the underlying political context, which will influence how well we are able to scale up. I'm not sure if you mean the second or not, but in the first, in terms of understanding the why, there's really three things that are done typically in a study. And to be clear, this has nothing to do with randomized trials per se. I think one of the most common misperceptions out there is that randomized trials are somehow worse at understanding the why than other methods. They're not better, but that's like neither here nor there, right? It's any study always is challenged by this question of establishing the why, and we establish the why in order to try to get external validity so that we can go elsewhere and say, well, in these contexts, this was the theory as to why this was not working, and so in these contexts over here, that can work too. So the three things that are almost always thought through, and sometimes more so than others, obviously there's some studies that are better and worse on these dimensions. One is by having a clear theory. Go back to think about like what's the theory that made this thing a problem in the first place, and why do you think this worked? Was it information? Go back to the questions about adoption of technology and understand, okay, why do we think people were not adopting? Have some theory at least up front. Take the deworming. There, I'm going to make it really, really simple and stupid. To say there, a simple theory is one of the underlying contextual factors that's necessary to make that work is that there must be an infestation of worms, right? We're not going to solve truancy problems in inner city London by passing out deworming pills, right? So there I have my theory. It was stupid. I mean it to be tongue-in-cheek, but the point is you had some theory that told us about the underlying context, that this is going to work and not, and then we can go elsewhere and we can think about what this tells us to when to apply it, when not to. Then it's also about the data that are collected. And a lot of times there's process data that can be collected along the way, diagnostic data that can be collected as part of a study that help establish what the changes were that were happening that weren't the final outcomes that we cared about at an ultimate level, but that along the way we see happening and then tells us that, okay, that's an indication that this is the channel through which something worked. So as an example, if we're doing something that involves a lot of training, we'd like to see knowledge go up. If we don't see knowledge go up, then we might be quick to think, okay, I don't think that training part was really what was making this work. Right? It wasn't a knowledge gap. And the third is, and this does take advantage of randomized designs, is sometimes we can set up, sometimes you have multiple treatment arms that are exactly done because you realize that if you just have the treatment and a control, you're going to be a little bit in the dark as to what within this treatment was working. Why did this work? So as an example, one of the projects we're doing in northern Ghana is a social safety net program that is very holistic. It provides 4 goats to a household that's ultra poor, community support, helping the community as a whole identifies the households. So they're supposed to kind of buy in and have pay some attention to these households. They're given 4 goats, they're given training, they're given hand holding, weekly meetings or with the program officer to see how their goat is doing, health care support in some way. So lots of things are happening. And in the end, it's going to be hard to give you a pinpoint why. So one of the things we did is we set up a second treatment arm that just gave out 4 goats. That way we can see, if we find the same treatment effect from these 2 groups, we can say that the problem had to do with the old cliche, you need money to make money. Right? And that turns out that theory, so to speak, behind that cliche was nailing it. I don't personally expect that to be what we find. I expect us to find that the other stuff matters. That's my prediction, but at the end of the day, I set up the test because that's just a prediction, right? We'll find out. But that's an example where we added a treatment arm in order to help understand the why, and with that understanding will give us more external validity to be able to go elsewhere with more confidence to say, here's the set of things that one needs to do in this context. So those are the 3 ways that I think describes it. And and all studies have there's a spectrum across all studies of how good they are in terms of doing those types of things to make it so that there's more external validity or less.
Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
Does that answer your question? Okay.
I'm Naomi Eisenstadt. I'm now a senior research fellow at Oxford, but I'm a former civil servant. What I found the talk really, really interesting and really good. The challenge I found that the issue about identifying the question, I think that's the hardest bit, because my policy experience is that it's very, very difficult to get ministers to agree what the question is, and as you go along, they change the question all the time. So that's one problem. The other problem I find still is the confusion between evidence base in terms of randomized controlled trials and co-production with local users. And in the same studies, people say they want both, and it seems to me you can't do both because you need some standardization of inputs if you're going to do an RCT. Does that make sense?
What do you mean by co-production?
Well, the whole community development approach about we're
Okay.
going to get local parents decide what's most important for them, and they know what's best for their children, and they, this
Okay.
is where we've had, I mean,
Okay.
I want
Now
a chapter in
I
your book
understand.
on
Okay.
failure. Believe me, I can
Excellent.
write a chapter in the book on failure.
So the second is easier for me to answer than the first. The first, a bit abstract, so I'm not sure how to, it's hard if people keep wanting to change what they want, but, the second is I would say that we have seen some good RCTs on this, but what you're doing when you evaluate that is you're evaluating the process. So, if you have 500 villages, and there's been IPA studies that did exactly this, where they go into 250 and they do a community-driven development. And 250 they did not. And then they track the outcomes. Now what makes it hard is in those 250, if 125 of those did health and 125 of them did some education, you can't just go to the health villages that chose health and measure health, and the education ones and measure education, because you don't know in the control what they would have done. So what you're doing is you're saying, we're measuring a whole litany of outcomes, health, education, and things like this. If you have some way in getting communities to first say what they would do if they were given the resources, then you can even be more narrow in what you measure. But that's hard to say abstractly, like what you can pull off in any given setting. But the point is, overall, what you're going to do is evaluate the process. And there's nothing about a randomized trial that says you can't do that. at all. You just need to say we're evaluating the process of empowering this local community with a grant of $10,000 and some training led by an NGO or a government that's going to bring people together and show them this process. You have 4 meetings, you talk about your problems, you come up with an idea, you allocate the money, you provide some, and that's what community-driven development does. And there's absolutely nothing about that that can't be done under the auspice of a randomized trial.
Okay.
It does require a large study. You can't do two communities and 2 communities, right? So it requires. So I wouldn't say there's absolutely nothing. I would say there's only one thing: constrain its budget.
Okay, let's have a few more questions. We've got, yes, just immediately behind Kerry, and then we'll go further back, Lauren. Yeah.
Karlan, I've worked in development since I was very young. What's the difference in the struggle when you're attempting to use evidence in a developed country as versus a developing country? Who's going to actually learn from who?
I don't know that I've seen a difference in my own work, in my own engagement with government at both levels. But I'd have a hard time. I don't want to. I guess I did just go on the record. I don't want to go on the record on that one. I'd have to really think hard to say whether it's easier or harder in one. I mean, I can point to many a situation in individuals that were open and eager to use evidence and some that were not. But I don't off the top of my head see a correlation across countries on that.
And one of the things people have said here is that some people have real qualms. I think we had a comment from a guy who runs the Education Endowment Foundation, which is set up to establish an evidence base on helping disadvantaged children, that actually people have qualms about the notion that people are being experimented on, that my child is being experimented on with this intervention or whatever. And I just wondered whether there was a lower barrier to experiment on people in developing countries where it's sort of aid funded and already quite a paternalistic relationship, as opposed to in developed countries.
Yeah. I mean, there shouldn't be a lower barrier. I would say that I have 2 thoughts. One is, at all times, we should be asking whether the research requires some intrusion into people's lives in many cases, doing some measurement, and some expenditure on the research. And so when I think about the ethics questions, I think about that, and whether the money is better spent on more deworming pills or more bed nets or more chlorine dispensers and things like this. Are we going to actually learn something out of this or not? If we're not going to learn anything out of it, then I would say it's unethical to do it. So it's not about randomized trials and treatment control. This is just about the expense at all. And if it's not going to be credible, what's learned, then it's unethical. Because what's the point? The second point, though, is about the salience of a control group that's held back. So there, I think, we're letting emotion, when we let that influence our perceptions of ethics, we're letting emotions dictate our ethics, not logic. Because when we think about what the research is for, it's in a very kind of idealistic view, and this is I think at least my view, we're doing it so that we can allocate future resources better. So if we don't do research to figure out what works, what we are doing is experimenting on future generations and current generations by not having evidence. So if our goal is to minimize experimentation, having a control group minimizes experimentation. Otherwise, we're experimenting. The difference is salience and emotion. It's very salient to us when we have a control group and we can point to 1,000 people. It's not as salient to just be told, I have no idea if this policy works. That doesn't give us that same salience. So that's emotion over logic.
Okay. Sorry about that random intervention for me. There.
No, that's fine. That's a good question.
Thanks. Tim Unwin, Secretary General of the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organisation. Thank you for bounding your talk. I mean, enthusiastic, great. I think I'm probably one of those people here who fit in the research that isn't suitable for randomized trials. So that gives you a hint where I'm coming from. My question is really that surely much evidence-based policy research is itself policy-driven. And by that, I mean finding evidence to suit the policy you want. And I think there's a great danger of us falling into that trap. And to give you an empirical example, I mean, the 1 laptop per child so-called research. Right? You may say it's good research and bad research, but there's an awful lot of good research that's been done to show it is wonderful. Equal amount of, or probably less quantity, but much better quality research to show one laptop per child is a disaster. And
I haven't seen the stuff that said it was good. I'd be curious.
You haven't seen stuff that says it's good?
I've never seen.
Oh, I'm delighted. So we are on the same side.
Yeah.
But
I was not on the side until I saw the funniest abstract I've ever seen. I remember the first randomized trial.
But the question about so much so-called evidence-based policy research actually being policy-driven and therefore not neutral. I mean, you've tended to convey an image that somehow academics are pure and good and virtuous, which we know they're not. I am one myself. There are difficult challenges around that, and I just wouldn't want to go away thinking it was quite as simple and neat and tidy as you've proposed.
It's not, but I think there are some guiding principles to organizing. So we're now in a little bit of meta. I'm going to throw out like a few examples of good meta things that are being done to try to police the world a little better on this. One is a registry. So we now have one in social science. We did not before. The medical registries would not take things that were just pure social science interventions. The American Economic Association just started one in the United States, so now we have one. A data repository, IPA is starting one. It's now, like, I don't know exactly when it's launching, but very soon. At least my stuff is already going up. And that is so that the data is open. Once a study is published, data open for everyone to be analyzing and then argue if they want to interpret the results differently, let them at it, right? A third is, I think, an important thing, which is independence. Right? There's a reason why NGOs should not be running their own internal RCTs when they're not, really a dedicated research entity, and it really is that their lifeline is if the results don't come out positive. And so, you should always think twice about looking at a randomized trial that is, branded and whatnot. And likewise, private science. So I can tell you before IPA had a general counsel, when I was president and executive director, we would get contracts. I would just do one thing. It wasn't my day job. There's one thing I cared about. And I just zoomed right to the intellectual property line, and if there was something that restricted IPA's freedom to write the results, whatever they were, we would walk away, we would never touch it. And I would say you should question the judgment of anybody who signs that. And I have personally walked away from projects with groups that refused to let the results be open. The funniest one was one which said, no, we're not deciding now, we'll decide later. We're not telling you won't have freedom, we'll decide that later. And unfortunately, this person was not as, humorous as you guys are. They did not think this was funny, and this is an issue, but it's easily stopped to a certain extent, to the extent that these things are, able to be made transparent. So I think there's things that we can all do. The last, which I have not seen as much, which I would like to say, I tried doing this once in the US unsuccessfully, but the block was not on the funding side, which is to set up the two sides, set up a test, which is a fair test, where I, as a researcher, this is the context I was in, obviously it doesn't, the researchers say, look, we're going to just set up a test. If side A is right, then this number goes up. If side B is right, this number goes down. Let's go set up a test. Let's get all sides who are so adamant in their views that they, of course, think their number is going to go up or down. So they are happy to participate because they believe in their ideology. I'm not saying this always would work, but in the context I was in, I had both sides agreeing to this. We lacked on the funding side to do it, but get the parties to agree up front to the test and have them be part of it, and have everybody agree on the measurement. I think that would be a very interesting thing to do. I've never seen that actually play out that way. If there's a hot debate in your field where you think that's a viable process to get the two sides to agree to the test up front, by all means, please be in touch with me. I would love to brainstorm with you, even just if, just to brainstorm with you on how to do that. But I think that would be a beautiful showcase of how to use this type of thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
there's somebody just immediately behind, yeah?
Thanks.
And then down
Hi,
here.
Patrick Wilson, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. We do all sorts of RCTs and other evaluations with NGOs and government agencies all over the world, including the UK. Some really interesting points from what you just said about open data and also transparency in the randomization process if you've got multi-arm trials. One project that we're just starting which builds on quite a lot of work in Zimbabwe and South Africa and Zaire, is antiretroviral therapy randomized controlled trial. It's a multi-arm trial, and there have been randomization ceremonies by which all the communities are informed of exactly how the randomization process works. And then it's a bit like the FA Cup, all the balls go into a bag, and then at community level, you know, the village representatives pull out the balls, and basically, you know, they don't know what they're going to get, but they know they're either going to get a treatment or random. And I think it's actually, in some ways, we're talking about developing versus developed world. In some ways, it's much easier to do that in developing countries. We've also been working on a lot of UK projects with agencies, and I think the issue here is, as you said, I mean, the idea that people who are on the control program are going to be missing out. And I think in some ways that's more sensitive in developed countries who think that we should be able to provide universal coverage than developing countries where it's understood that resources are much more limited. Just a very general point, no evidence to back that up, but just a feeling working across the board. Particularly there's one that was London Health Commission funded, where we're looking at randomizing communities, very local interventions for public health. And it became very political very quickly as to how much information was given to participants. But if we're interested in open data for publications, our colleague Ben Goldacre, who you mentioned, is leading on the All Trials campaign, and if you haven't already signed that up, then please do.
Okay, that could be another sign-up sheet. Let's come, got one question there, and then we'll come there, and there's be, might do a last bunch. Yes, very good.
Okay, yeah, Dave.
I have to make it quick now.
Just wanted to link what you said at the outset about academics not engaging very much with the audience that they're doing the research about, and linking that to your point C, which is about disseminating information. So for example, in a school setting, you might be doing some kind of research which involves the school leadership. But if you share that research with the students and you have some recommendations coming out of that, it's probably more likely to be taken on board, because the senior management team will know that actually the population is seeing it. So I just wondered, what were some of the ethical issues that you might face dealing with that, and how you get over some of that? And speaking of ethical issues, Thaler and Susskind have already been criticized for sort of mind control manipulation, and I won't add to that. But just to say, in your last point C again, you talked about the opt-out versus opt-in, and this has caused huge controversy recently in the Welsh Assembly, where they're talking about organs donations.
What's on the what?
Organ donation.
Organ donation, where they're saying that standard should be an opt-out. So to what extent some of that cuts across ethical issues where people are effectively deprived of a choice? And even in your example of coming to the event and saying that by coming to the event, you agree to sign up on our list unless you're opt-out. To what extent, you know, people don't even read that, they just attend on it. So how do you run into ethical issues with your opt-out? And I know it's strongly advocated in your issue, in your sort of approach to point C. But, you know, what are the ethical issues around that, and how do you deal with that?
Okay, just to point out, we didn't actually opt you all into their mailing list or whatever. We could have done in very small print at the bottom. So anyway, we failed to plan enough in advance.
There's no one answer to that. It's context specific. There's some situations where I would say it's ethical to opt in. Some where I'd say the ethical thing to do is to opt out, the optimal. So it depends on the situation. The point is you have to choose something. That's it. You have to choose something. So you're being totally naive. One is being naive to think that like some opt-in is somehow inherently more ethical than opt-out. Like if the goal is to simply maximize the number of people who get what they would want in a moment of self-reflection, then one can then think about empirically what policy is more likely to get more people to the point at which they would want in a moment of self-reflection, and then go do that.
The thing is that if the status quo is that you don't harvest organs, so for example in a car accident, if that is the status quo.
Why does the status quo matter?
No.
No, that's arbitrary.
People have to opt out of that.
No, but why is it? No. There's no status quo. There's no status quo. You're now just choosing a policy. There is no such thing as status quo that has any meaning on ethics.
No,
in the way I'm saying.
Opt out of something that actually cuts across a lot of people who don't actually look at the fine print and so on. And I think that actually is imposing a status quo that doesn't exist.
You're assuming it's fine. No. You're assuming it's fine print that nobody reads. I never said that. You can make it loud and clear all you want.
But if you're saying that there's no such thing as a status quo, I'm saying by your opt-out policy, over opt-in, you're imposing.
No, I'm never saying there's no such thing as status quo. I'm saying status quo should not factor into our ethical assessments. There's a big difference.
You may have to continue that outside.
Yeah.
So we're going on. It's
You're
it's a very interesting
assuming a
question.
lot of things about everything I've put in, like that disclosure policy is hidden. I'm not saying that. So imagine a simple world in which you are able to actually assess what everybody wants in a moment of self-reflection, and then maximize that is one way of thinking about it. Or,
Well, there's some very interesting results emerging from the early results of the change on the default on pensions as a result of the Turner reforms, which should be quite interesting. Yes, here.
Okay, Clive Bates, Counterfactual Consulting. You've defined a very good system here for working out, good evidence base, what works, and sort of what should be done. What about the receptiveness of people with money, the donors, the decision makers in this system? Because you could create this sort of evidence base, and if everyone ignores it, you don't really get anywhere with it. So what are the characteristics of the decision makers and the funders that mean that they're receptive to this as something happens? So, transparency, evaluation panels, the way that the intended beneficiaries are engaged and so on. And is there a sort of agenda around that that you've engaged in at all?
no, I mean, absolutely. You're kind of hitting at the entirety of what I would say was the C category, which is, and there's no one single answer. There's many different things that need to be done to engage with people so that they can see that the evidence gets used. There are situations too. I do think about the world in somewhat in two categories, in terms of how we want the evidence to get used. There's working with donors, and then there's working with the people that are doing things. I wouldn't go all into one. If we thought we could perfectly deal with one, then we wouldn't need to do with the other. But that's not the way the world works. So there's many situations, for instance, where I think there are donors that are. I've had conversations with. When I did my book, I gave lots of public book talks, and I was always amazed after giving a talk where I did actually get a little bit wonky and talk about randomized trials, explain it. And someone would often come up to me at the very end and say something along the lines of, wow, this is, really great. I really appreciate this. This is exactly how I've always thought about things. Let me give you an example. I've been supporting this group in Rwanda, and I demanded that they give me data to show this. And they told me the deals of what they did, and it had nothing resembling what I would describe as evidence. And it was kind of depressing. And I was like, ugh. And I realized, very quickly not to try to explain to this person the difference. And instead to realize that, look, sometimes there's cases where people are really just driven by emotion to give, and that's good. Emotion is what makes us give in the first place. It's not, people don't usually give after the analytical process. They give emotionally, and then we want to focus them on things that work. But there's some people, the emotional is really what's driving it, and the analysis, whether we can do our best or not, is not going to be that strong. So that's a situation where we just want to have them give, and then we want to work with the organization to see that they choose good ideas. Because there's going to be some organization that's going to have some decision-making power over what to do with the money they receive. And so that's where we can have a lot of impact, is by working with the NGO that received the donation or the government that's running a policy. So we work on both sides to try to see that these things happen. There's no one channel, and there's lots of success stories, and there's lots of conversations which you can tell. It's just you're not going to convince. It's not going to happen.
Dean, I just wanted to ask one
Yeah.
question at the end. When we do quite a lot of things at the Institute for Government with academics, and if we're talking to early career academics, they will say, well, they're now told they have to make an impact. But they say that's competing with all the other things I have to do. Basically, I have to get all these, journal articles published in single-authored, single-disciplined things, and that's really what takes the time off. And moreover, if I'm doing all these things to put myself about a bit, then I get resentment from people higher up who think I'm going too big for my boots, and the academic politics comes into play. And I just wonder, what's different about the US university system that sort of gives an incentive for someone like you to go out and spend so much time on things like dissemination, engaging with policymakers? I mean, are you differently incentivized, or basically you're competing with Yale all the time? You say, but we want you to be writing lots, you obviously are writing lots of articles. We don't want you to be doing all this sort of impacty stuff. Because we've got something odd in the way we set up our universities at the moment, which we're trying to row against, which seems to be incentivizing people to do things which don't necessarily incentivize engaging with policy and actually making a difference in the real world as opposed to in academia.
Yeah, I don't think it's, I mean, the academics I know in the US, in the UK at least, I wouldn't say it's different. I don't think there's institutional differences. I think we both have this tension. There are a lot of universities that do reward that type of policy engagement work. It is true that the policy engagement work that I've partaken, including starting IPA, has made me more productive on the research side. They do go back and forth to each other. You know, having said that, there's certainly a lot of academics who are just not interested in that type of engagement. They just want to do their research, and that's exactly why one of the reasons we started IPA was to say, look, we'll do the policy wonky stuff. You just do your research. The other thing I would say is that it is true that, and I see this when we see incoming students and applicants now. You know, there's two types of people who apply for PhD programs now. There's people who apply for a PhD program in economics, and they give some explanation about seeing mathematics. It's always kind of funny, these essays where they talk about economics as this mathematical depiction of the world and the beauty of seeing everything formulaically. And then there's another group which says there's some real problems out there in the world, and we're struggling as a society to solve them. And here's a discipline which provides both theoretical and empirical tools, which I think are really effective at helping us understand how to solve problems better. And so I want a PhD in order to go do that. And we're seeing a lot more in that second category than we used to in terms of people coming in to PhD programs. And so it is the case that, you know, the point is not all of academics are there are a lot of economists certainly that do have this kind of dual motive to what they're doing.
Okay, well, it's bang on 2 o'clock. We said we'd let you away by 2 o'clock to go back to whatever crises are happening around at 2 o'clock on the 27th of August. But before we go, if you didn't sign up, I think Dean's still got the list. Hopefully that went round all of the rooms. Very big thank you to Dean for taking time out from his sort of holiday working break in the UK. And hopefully this is more entertaining than Arsenal Fenerbahce tonight, she said, showing my knowledge of football, because actually it's going to be my one football match this decade. Anyway, so thanks very much for Dean for coming to...